We come to a close of a series that we've been talking about, I Want to Believe But, and this kind of series, the series kind of grew out of a couple of books that we were reading together as staff. And there were some researchers that a few years ago began noticing a trend in the United States. It's been going on in Europe for a while, but it's called the nuns, the rise of the nuns. That's N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, all right? The nuns. And it means those people who on surveys and things like that, when it talks about your religious affiliation, they check the box none. You know, we're not affiliated with anything. The nuns are kind of a fast-growing movement of people who have walked away from faith. Many of them were involved in church in their younger years, but they have walked away. They say they have deconverted from being a Christian or whatever religion that they were a part of. And it's interesting to hear them talk. About 23% of people in the United States identify by saying that they are a nun. This is kind of atheist 2.0. They don't want to say they're atheists, so they say they're nuns, or maybe agnostics, but they're called nuns. And about 35% of all those who check themselves to say that they are not affiliated or nuns are in the millennial age group, all right? Generation that we call the millennials. And it's interesting to hear because basically they're saying, I just don't want to have anything to do with religion or church or anything else. Don't talk to me about it. I want to talk to you about it. I want to tell you why, and sometimes they're pretty militant as to why you should not believe in God. You should not believe in the Bible. You should not believe in Christ or anything else. It's interesting as I've kind of been doing some research and I've been getting into conversations with different people about this whole issue where they have stepped back from being in church, stepped back from being a believer in God. There's some things that kind of follow a pattern, and this is true as you read different blogs about those who have deconverted. And the pattern seems to be that at one point in their life, they were a believer, or at least they felt like they were. They were involved in church. Many would cite a childhood salvation experience in their life, but then something happened. Maybe it was an event, or more than likely it's a change within their life where either their parents moved and they got new friends, or they went away to college, or perhaps they graduated from college and they moved to a whole different part of the United States or a different area and had to develop new friends. And in the process of that, they've just decided, I don't need God anymore. Don't really necessarily want to talk about it all, but they get involved in a new and particularly different type of lifestyle. And maybe this happened to you. Maybe when you were a certain age, maybe you went to college or you moved to a different area and you got together with some new friends and you began to participate in some things that you had never participated in before. And you kind of liked it. Matter of fact, you liked it a lot. It's so much so that you decide, I'm going to step back from my beliefs, and you developed a system of new beliefs that did not include God at all. And when I hear the stories of people talking about their deconversion, and they talk about the reason that they did that, it's really, they kind of came up with the reasons after certain events happened in their life. They become involved in a particular behavioral pattern, or they became involved in a different lifestyle. And so then they developed reasons for why they choose now no longer to believe in God. And the whole process is, as I listen to their stories, to be honest, is kind of heartbreaking. It just kind of breaks my heart, especially when they begin talking about how they view God. And I'll be honest with you, when I hear them describe God, the God that they no longer believe in, I want to say, I'm with you there. I don't believe in that God either. I mean, it's such a distortion of what the Bible presents as who God was. So for the last 5 weeks that we've been in this series, we've been talking about those different distortions of God, different misconceptions that we get about who God is. And as we go through that, we've discovered that sometimes what we have grown up thinking about certain things about God are not necessarily true. They're not necessarily biblical at all. And so that's why we have been in this series and talking about it. It is a big phenomenon, and we would like to equip you as a follower of Jesus to be able to engage in conversations, because kind of the tendency is anymore, we don't want to engage. We just kind of sit back and people will state their reasons, and we don't really want to engage in those conversations. It's important. It is very important for us to engage and to still keep in contact and in conversation with people who have now felt like they have deconverted, as it were, okay? So here's what we're going to do this morning. We wrap up this series today, all right? And what I want to do this morning is I want to ask you a question, a really difficult question, all right? Then we want to go through 3 different quotes, and then there's going to be a series of other questions I want to talk with you about at the very end of our time together this morning, all right? So a question, 3 quotes, and then a bunch of questions. Are you ready for that? I'm going to sit here this morning. I'm not going to walk around because I don't want to be embarrassed or you be embarrassed because I fall off the stage today, okay? So hopefully you can stay up with me as I walk in my mind but not on my feet around on the stage today. So here we go. First question. And as I said, it's a difficult question. And when I say difficult, it's not like it's difficult for you as opposed to other people. I'm saying it's hard for all of us, all right? I know it's hard for me to answer this question. I don't really like the question, but here's the question. The question is, would you be honest with yourself today? All right? Would you be honest with yourself today? And it's hard. I believe it's, if nothing else, we are more self-deceived than we realize, all right? And none of us like to admit that, but it's true. Whenever I look in the mirror and I am super honest with myself, you know, I'm actually honest with that reflection in the mirror. You know what happens to me? I end up with homework assignments. Does that sound weird? I end up with homework assignments. And what I mean by that is this, is that I realize that there's still some work to be done in my life. In my picture perfect world that I like to portray on Facebook and things like that, there are no flaws. But when I look in the mirror, I realize that there are some flaws. And so in that homework thing that I have to do, generally it ends up with this. Generally I have to go to somebody and apologize for my behavior. That's a bummer. Anybody like to apologize for their behavior? I'm looking. All right, nobody does. All right, you're with me this morning, okay? We don't like to do that. And generally, if I'm absolutely honest with myself, there's generally something that I have to admit that I don't want to admit, that I don't want to own up to. And when I'm really honest with myself, I have to humble myself. And humility and James McCracken doesn't really come together real well, all right? I'm admitting, this is my honesty time this morning. Now, I know that most of you think, oh, James, you are the most humble person next to Moses that I know. You evidently have not talked to my wife, if that's what you believe, all right? So humility does not come natural to any of us. But here's something that we all learn as adults, that when we deceive other people, that's one thing. We can present an image, we can present things, but when we deceive other people, that's one thing. But self-deception takes us always in a bad direction. Would you agree with that? Self-deception always takes us in a bad direction. As a matter of fact, if you're wondering what in the world this whole time that we're talking about this morning, the one big idea, it's this. Self-deception always takes us in a bad direction. Would you say that with me? Self-deception always takes us in a bad direction. What does self-deception do? Takes us in a bad direction. All right. Now here's if you're not honest with yourself, if I'm not honest with myself, I can't go where I need to go. I mean, I automatically put a lid on my life, all right? You remain stuck in a situation. You're in a rut. If you're not honest with yourself, it's always a lid to growth in your life. And here's how I know this, and here's how you know this. Think about how different your life would have been growing up if your dad had been honest with you, been honest with himself, or your mom had been honest with herself. But instead, like we do as adults, we played a lot of games, and we won't take responsibility for areas in which we know we may be amiss on, And we kind of go off and we maintain this image. And for some of you, your growing up experience would have been vastly different if somebody had the ability to look themselves in the mirror and honestly face up to some things within their life. And in fact, some of you who are divorced probably would still be married if you or your spouse, your ex-spouse, were able to say, you know what? I need to quit making excuses for the behavior that I'm involving myself in. I need to take responsibility for my life. So for the next few minutes, I want to challenge you, for those of you who may be here this morning, you've stepped away from faith, and maybe somebody has asked you to be here, to be honest with yourself. And I want to challenge all of you who say you're a follower of Jesus, also to be honest with yourself. Because, guys, we as Christians sometimes are not very honest with ourselves. There are areas in our life that we do not want to take responsibility for, and we struggle with that within our area. So it's difficult. It's extremely difficult for you and I to be honest with ourselves. Now, I know. When I say that, it comes across as being pretty insulting, doesn't it? What do you mean? I'm not honest with myself. What are you talking about? And those around you are going, okay? So just for a second, if you just want to hold your hand up and point to somebody close to you and say, I hope they hear this morning, you may do that, all right? But it'd be better if you went, I hope I hear this morning, okay? Just be honest, all right? So here we go. First quote, all right? In preparation for this series, there's some books that, as I said, we were reading together as a staff, and there's some that I read but two of the books that I read in preparation for this series was written by a guy by the name of Thomas Nagel. Thomas Nagel is a professor of law and philosophy at New York University, and written two kind of interesting books. Now, what is amazing to me about Nagel is the fact that he is astonishingly honest about things. And he wrote one book called The Mind and Cosmos. The subtitle of the book is something like How Neo-Darwinianism Does Not Ring True in Certain Areas of Life. And that's the subtitle of it. Caused a big stir among in the scientific world because of his book. The second book that he wrote was called The Last Word. And in this book, he talks about why we should be atheists, why there should be no God. And he makes it an incredibly honest paragraph on page 130 in his book. He says this. He says, I want atheism to be true. And I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. Now that is a huge, huge statement by a person who is militantly atheist. And most of the guys who are in that area, if you've heard them do TED Talks and things like that, they would never make a statement like that, because anybody that believes in God at all has to be stupid to the nth degree. He goes on to say this. He said, it isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Wow, that is amazing admission. I don't want the universe to be like that. Now, there's a big and important difference, guys, between I don't believe it and I don't want to believe it. Huge difference between I don't believe that and I will not believe it. I don't want to believe that. And as you listen to conversations from people who have walked away from faith, what you essentially hear is this. I got away from that whole religious thing, that church thing, because and now I'm enjoying what I was doing. Before I never enjoyed things, and I've decided, you know what? I don't want to follow all those rules. I don't want those rules. I don't want that lifestyle. So I don't believe it anymore. And so I searched for it, and I found the reasons that I don't believe in God anymore. And I know this is prying, but maybe the reason you don't believe anymore is that you found your faith inconvenient. And maybe you as a follower for Jesus, maybe one of the reasons you've backed out of fellowship with other people, maybe one of the reasons that you don't engage in fellowship with other Christians is you find it more convenient not to be a follower of Jesus in certain areas of your life, because it just kind of contends with what we want. Now, this is where it gets tough. And this is where we've got to be honest with ourselves. And this is why I'm asking you to be honest with yourself and not go anywhere in your mind through the rest of this time that we're together. I can see that some of you are wanting to edge out the door, but your body remains here, all right? So stay engaged if you will, all right? If your departure from faith was around will and want, information that people give you will never suffice because you just don't want to. So whatever anybody else says, if it's objective one way or another, you don't want to be there. That's why when people discuss things with you, it just kind of boom, 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 bounces off because we don't want to go there. All right, quote number 2, all right? This is from Blaise Pascal, who was a 17th century mathematician and physicist and philosopher. Now, it's funny, it's interesting. He died very young, his child prodigy, just brilliant guy in the 17th century. Most of what we know about him are from things that he wrote down on pieces of paper and stuck in his bureau drawer, all right? And so we have lots of quotes available. But here's one of his quotes. He says this: people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find what? Attractive. Anybody guilty of this? Oh, wait a minute. I better not put my hand down. We're all guilty of this. You know, we don't wake up every day saying, I am on a truth quest today. I'm out for truth, and I don't care what it is. I'm willing to abandon all my presuppositions. I just want truth. I don't know if anybody wakes up that way. If you do wake up that way, I want to meet you. I don't want to spend much time with you, but I want to meet you, all right? Because most of us are not on a truth quest. We're on a happiness quest, aren't we? We want to be happy. We spent about 6 weeks, 8 weeks earlier in the spring talking about what is the happiness quest, and God does want us happy. But to be honest, we are concerned more about happy than we are truth. And I'm all about having a worldview, set of values, a set of principles for my life, as long as they make me happy. And if they're making me happy, I'll abandon everything else so that I can be happy. I'm not on a truth quest. That's where most of us are. Now, it'd be nice to know what truth is and believe the truth, but at the end of the day, 99% of people, they just want to be happy. Quote number 3, all right? And this is from Augustine, sometimes called St. Augustine. He says, we love the truth when it enlightens us. We hate the truth when it what? We all get this, don't we? How many of you, I'm looking at our senior and junior higher out of this service, so let me phrase it this way. When you were growing up, did you ever get in an argument with your parents? None of you got into arguments with your parents? Oh, I'm sorry. They were discussions, weren't they? Discussions that you had with your parents, all right? And you argued with your parents. Were you trying to get to the truth? Or were you trying to get your way? Mom and Dad, let's find the truth. Let's sit down and talk about this, and let's find the truth. Oh, Mom, you're right. I'm wrong. You've enlightened me. Did those words ever come out of your mouth? No. We didn't argue with our parents that way. I didn't argue to get to the truth. As a kid, I won my way. That's the reason I argued. And we argued at times, and there are times that I walked away and I got my way, but I walked away knowing. I just knew. I knew that I knew that I knew that they were, I won't say that word. Haven't you ever been in an argument, with your spouse? I'm sorry, you don't argue with your spouse. You have discussions, don't you? The discussion with your spouse, and halfway through the argument or discussions, you realize, uh-oh, they're right. Yeah. And what do you do? What do I do? I keep on arguing because my goal is to win the argument. I'm all about the wins. How do you do that, W's? I'm all about the W. And so, hey, I'll argue and argue and argue because if I win, then obviously I'm smarter than you are. I get to say, gotcha, I won. We may win because we're better with words. We may win because the other person just gives up, or we may win when we're on the telephone. Mom, Dad, I'm going to be late coming home tonight. What? I can't stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning? But Mom, it's good for me. I know it is. Oh, we're disconnected. I must have won the argument. You know, those are the type of things we have. And so if you're one that wants to win an argument, which all of us are, do you grasp what that means? Do you know what it means to acknowledge that we might be wrong? We don't like that, do we? Maybe it means that there's something else in the mix. Maybe there's more to this energy that we're displaying in these discussions and arguments and rebuttals on certain areas in our life than we're willing to acknowledge. And what is that? I mean, if you're a person who just doesn't want to believe, I want to do what I want to do, there's no argument or information that will change your mind. It doesn't really matter what is true and what's not. You just want to win the argument. So, last series of questions. Could it be, if there is a God, could it be the reason that you have stepped away from faith? Could it be the reason that you don't obey in certain areas of your life? Could it be that reason is not that there's not a God, but that there are some things in your life, maybe it's in the past, maybe it's in the present, that you don't want to deal with? They are, and even though you don't like to use this word, they're embarrassing. Could it be if there is a God, I got to keep these things locked away. I got to build this wall where I don't have to confront myself with it. And maybe you've used a cultural label for it. You said, well, when I was younger, I may have made some mistakes. Maybe perhaps I might have. Or maybe when I was younger, well, you know, nobody's perfect. We like to use those phrases. But if we crack the door open a little bit and we say, if there is God, well, that could be terrifying. You could be scared. Is it possible that you know, if I crack the door on the fact that there is God, that it's not just a few mistakes, that it's bigger than that? That if God exists, it transitions from me saying it's mistakes to the fact that I've sinned. Boy, that's a word that's not common in our vocabulary today. If God, then perhaps I'm guilty of something. I'm guilty of sin within my life. And maybe this is bigger than I've made some mistakes. Because, hey, come on, you admit it. Most of the time we say, yeah, I've made mistakes, but it only hurts what? Me. It's only me. It's only hurting me. It's not hurting anybody else. It's only hurting me. Do you really believe that? I have heard people who have abandoned their kids and left them and say it's not hurting anybody else but me. You try to convince your children of that later on. It won't work. And your biggest mistake is that it wasn't just hurting you and you keep putting that line. The biggest mistake is that you've hurt other people. And when you hurt other people, you owe them something. You owe somebody something. You owe them some things that perhaps you can never pay back. You cannot give back those first few years to your daughter. You cannot give back to your kids what you took from them because of what you were doing during that period of time. And maybe you just don't even want to crack that door at all. If there is a God, not only am I guilty of hurting myself, then I am also guilty of hurting other people. And if there is a God, I'm also accountable. Now, none of us like that idea, do we? None of us want to be accountable. We want other people to be accountable, don't we? And I mean, if you're messing up, I want you to be accountable to me. But if we mess up, no. I've got my own life to live. You can't tell me what to do. We want others to be accountable, but not me. We all want to play God because we want to hold other people accountable, but not ourselves. I mean, it's really the story of the Garden of Eden. Now, I know if you're here and you believe that the Bible is just stupid, made-up stuff that's all a myth, then you withdraw a little bit when I say Garden of Eden. If you believe it's history, whatever you believe the Garden of Eden is. If the Garden of Eden is a myth, I want to tell you it's the greatest myth in history. All right? Greatest myth in history, because the story of the Garden of Eden explains so much the way we are in our lives. It is a great explanation of our ability to self-deceive, all right? It's the beginning of all of mankind deciding, God, we don't need you. Actually, we don't want you. Who needs God? Not me. I can do whatever I want, whenever I want it, and just, you can't call me on it. I'm doing my own stuff. And if I get in trouble over it, it's not my fault. It's the woman that you made. And I've used that excuse a long time. It's not my fault. It's got to be my wife's fault, right? And wives, you've used the same thing. It's not my fault. It's got to be my husband's fault. All right? We've been doing that for a long time. In the book of Genesis, as in all of our life, it plays out with the illusion that we're autonomous. The autonomy thing. I will be my own person. I am the captain of my soul. Really? I can do whatever I want to do. I can make my own choices. I do make my own choices, which always, 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 always leads to regret. When unaccountable people make regretful decisions, it hurts people who were unaccountable. Unaccountable people make regretful decisions. I'll do it my way. I'll do it the way I want to do it. And nobody needs to tell me what to do. Nobody can try to rein me in one way or the other. I can handle it. I can manage it. I can manage the consequences. I'm just hurting me. Unaccountable people always make regretful decisions. And you get two unaccountable people, autonomous people, and put them together in a marriage, then two autonomous people eventually have an unresolvable conflict, right? And the problem is, and I get this, if you begin to turn the direction towards God, if you admit to God, then you've got to submit to God. You got to decide that he's real. Because you know, if there is a God, that you and I are accountable. And our motto is, I ain't submitting to nobody. Nobody's going to put me under their thumb. And we do it in all areas of life. And to admit that there is a God means that we have to submit to him. So we live loud, busy lives until life gets our attention and some crisis goes. And then when it doesn't go our way, then we don't believe in God, but we blame him a lot. And if there is a God, it means a third thing. If there is a God, that means that I am wrong. I am what? Oh, you guys know how to say that word. Just hasn't been mentioned in your marriage in the last 50 years, has it? Hasn't been mentioned in other types of situations. I am wrong. What's in it that you and I can't say that word? Could it be pride? Could be. Hey guys, what is it in us? We know in our minds at times we're wrong. Guys are the worst. I can admit that. We have a hard time saying, I'm wrong. Now, we've got plenty of background history in our lives to know that we're wrong, don't we? I mean, you look back at your life, can't you at least find one thing that you knew you were wrong in? Oh yeah, I was wrong once in 1952. But when it comes right down to it, looking somebody in the eye and saying, I'm wrong, that makes it difficult. And yet, it's important for us to look in the mirror, and as we said, the very first question is, will you be honest with yourself? Because it's something we deal with all the time. Now, God says this over and over again throughout his word. And whether you believe it or not, that's up to you. But there is a huge insight into our human psyche when he says that humility is always the way forward. Humility is always the way forward. I don't know why we resist it. Humility always makes you wiser. Humility always opens you up to new information. The I have been wrong or I'm wrong is the most direct route in discovering what is right. Now, I know you want to check out. Look up here for just a moment because we're going to bring it to a close eventually, okay? But we're at least circling for a landing here, all right? You don't have to be honest with me, but you do need to be honest with yourself. It's essential. Did your arguments against God come after your decision not to want God? Did your arguments against God come after your decision not to want God? Isn't it true, or at least possibility, that your intellectual arguments against the existence of God or the Bible or whatever your thing is, isn't it true that they didn't come first? What came first was you decided, I don't want God. I don't want him around. But friends, not wanting God is not an argument. That's an emotion. It's a response. And then I decide I need some reasons to support my decision. And it explains why you've developed this arsenal of arguments against God. Because you, as Nagel admits, he says, I don't want there to be God. I don't want the universe to be that way. I want to be autonomous. And that brings us to the good news, all right? It's not just good news. It is ridiculously good news. And that's this. Don't miss this. When we're honest, when we're willing to be honest with ourselves and say, the real issue for me is not God's existence. The real issue for me is my own personal resistance. When we're willing to admit that the reason I don't want God is that there's some things that I want to be happy in, and I don't think if God's in my life, I can be happy in doing this anymore. When we're willing to admit that, if you get there, if you just take that little baby step and take that step, you have stepped into an epic narrative that's been going on since time began. It's the epic narrative of God pursuing a relationship with a rebel race that broke relationship with him. That is an epic narrative. And that's why it is such great news. Because once you are willing to admit, this isn't about God's existence. This is actually not about science. This is about my own personal resistance. It's my own personal desires in my life. Once you're willing to do that, you step into a stream of humanity that has struggled with submission to God since the very first time that man appeared on earth. And you're exactly where you need to be. Because if God exists, there's first of all forgiveness. There is. Your rebellion, your sin, your mistakes, your not perfect life, not everybody's perfecting, whatever you call it, they become the platform for God to demonstrate his love for you. In fact, the Apostle Paul said it perfectly. I don't have it on the screens. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to Romans chapter 5. Would you do that? If you have your phones, you can do it fairly quickly. Romans chapter 5, verse 8 says this. He says a word in this verse. You've probably heard this verse lots of times, but you may not remember it. But here's what he says, Romans 5, 8. But God, those of you who have your Bibles open, what's that next word? Demonstrates. God demonstrates. I'm going to stand up. If I fall off this thing, you'll catch me, right? You're not ready. Yeah, I want you ready. All right. He says, God demonstrates. It's not that God tells you about it. He demonstrated something. He did something. If you're wanting to be in a relationship with somebody else, I do lots of marital counseling. Have done it for down through a lot of years. And it's interesting to see, because guys, we don't get this very often, okay? But you'll have a couple come in, and she will say, generally it's the female that says, he doesn't love me anymore. Really, why? Well, not only does he not ever tell me, I would not know it at all by his actions. There's no demonstration. So, here's what God says. God demonstrates his own love for us. He doesn't just tell us about it. He doesn't, on anniversaries and Christmas and Thanksgiving, doesn't say, I love you, hun, and go on. There's a demonstration, all right? There's an actual demonstration there. He did something to prove his love for you. He demonstrates it. He says, he demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still mistakers, while we were still in the nobody's perfecting business, while we were still, what's that next word? Sinners. That's an admission we have to make. While we were still sinners, what did Jesus do? He died for us. He did. He died for us. He demonstrated how much he cares for us. Now, the new atheist says, why in the world does God have to inject all this blood and gore into the conversation? What's all this stuff about death? Well, you see, you remember when we talked about earlier about our mistakes, and who we hurt is not just ourselves, but we also hurt who? Who else do we hurt in our mistakes? Others, right? And we've hurt them pretty bad. And we owe them something. There's a debt that has to be paid. Well, here's how God demonstrated his love for you. He had no sin of his own. Perfect. Always did the right thing. Always had the right thoughts. Perfect. And he took what we deserve, death. He died for us. He demonstrated it. He demonstrated it. He didn't just talk about it. He demonstrated his love for us by dying and providing the restitution. What sin demands is death. And so he met the demands of the law, and he died for you. All right? So that is good news, friends. If there is God, there's also forgiveness. Even though you may have thumbed your nose at him, even though you want to be autonomous and you think you are autonomous, even though you think, I have it all, I'm the one that I'm the captain of my life, that's just an illusion. You're not autonomous. Everything you do is connected to other people, even though we don't like to think that way. It is connected. Our actions have consequences with not only with ourselves, but other people. And so he says, while you were still enemies of him, a sinner in a sense, you cannot have a relationship with somebody if you don't make a sacrifice to do that. This is right at the epicenter of everything we believe as Christians. God demonstrated his love for us. Through Christ, God demonstrated both his forgiveness and his restitution. Now, here's the thing. If there is a God, I'm guilty. If there is a God, there is relationship. And he offers that relationship to us. And finally, the third thing, if God, is that if there is God, there is also truth. That means there's moral law. There's values. That means that there is some sort of accountability within the universe. It's the basis for justice. Last week, Steve talked about an unjust God, and we get mad at God because we don't think he's just. He didn't handle this properly the way we think we ought to handle it. The only reason you know whether something is just or unjust is because there is a God of the universe who set up that value. If God does not exist, there is no value for that. Natural selection sure doesn't depend upon anything just. It's just the strongest wins every time. And so if there is a God, there is the value of morality. There's the basis for justice. So the question is, who needs God? Who needs God? Yeah, honestly, I do. I need you. Now, you may know this. Maybe you don't. But Jesus had brothers and sisters. You may come from a background that Jesus was an only child, but he actually had brothers and sisters that came along after him. And it's interesting that those brothers and sisters for a long time didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. He was just that older brother. How many of you had an older brother or sister? Did you have an older brother and sister that was just kind of perfect? I did. My sister was straight A student. You know, my grade cards had different forms of letters on it. Okay? She was an accomplished musician, and every teacher loved having her in classroom. Then James Frank came along. And it was like, oh, we thought you were going to be more like your sister. She was somewhat perfect. I knew her faults better than anybody else. I tried to tell her husband, but he wouldn't listen before he got married to me, all of her faults. But to live with someone who's just good at everything they do, it's just kind of, right? Some of you don't get that. Maybe you were the older one who thought they were perfect, all right? So here's Jesus who does everything right. Brothers and sisters don't really appreciate that too well. And some of the brothers and sisters come to try to get him at one point in his ministry when he is just swamped by people. He's done all these miracles. And in Mark 3 it says they came to take him home because they thought he was crazy. Some of you think Jesus is crazy today too. Maybe you're a brother or sister too. One of those brothers and sisters, a guy by the name of James. Okay? Good name, right? Good name, James. And he was one of those that didn't believe in Jesus at all. Matter of fact, didn't believe in that he was the Messiah, that he was Son of God or anything else until Jesus died on the cross and he was resurrected. And Jesus came in a particular appearance, sat down and talked with James. You know what? James changed his attitude. Changed his attitude. And he, became a very strong witness for Jesus, became kind of the leader of the church in Jerusalem for a period of time. In 62 AD, the Jews were really upset with James because of his witness. He kept the law as a Jew, but he still was a believer, a follower of Christ. And they were so upset because hundreds and thousands of people kept coming to Christ because of his teaching. And so they tried to get rid of him. And they decided they would arrest him, and they wanted him to recant. And he seemed to go along with this idea after this illegal trial. And they took him to the very top of the temple grounds, the pinnacle of the temple. And he was supposed to make an announcement that Jesus, there was no resurrection, that he was not the Son of God. I knew him, he was my brother and all that. So what did James do when he got up there? He begins teaching on the resurrection and why it's true. And people were applauding, and the Jews got very angry at him. Those who let him off pushed him off the top of the temple. He fell 300 feet below, smacked down, but he didn't die. And the Jews rushed down and began to stone him until he died. Now, he wrote one little letter. And the New Testament church, when they were assembling the New Testament, they weren't very creative with their titles of things. You know what his letter is called? James. Pretty creative, huh? Okay? So he writes this letter. And in his letter, he says something that I think kind of lands the plane for us this morning. Because here's a guy who didn't believe in Jesus for the longest time. And here's what he says. James chapter 4, verse 8 also. He says, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. In other words, you're thinking you don't believe in him? Take a step towards him. Open your mind up. Begin looking at some of the reasons. Just look at his life. Look at what he did. Look at what he said. You know, and I think this is kind of hard for James to say. I mean, when you have held a belief for a long time and you find out it's wrong, it's hard to have the humility to say, man, I screwed up. All those years, I chose not to support my brother. All those years, I turned my back on him. I knew there was miracles. People would tell me about them, but I refused to believe. I had all these arguments. And he realizes it's not an easy thing to draw near to God when you're drawn away from him. So the next thing he says, you'll love this. He says, wash your hands, you sinners. Now that's kind of a colloquialism. Basically what he's saying, figurative language, for saying, admit it. Acknowledge it wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just nobody's perfect, nobody can live up to this. It was sin. Purify your hearts, he goes on to say, you double-minded. Ooh, ouch, that's offensive. You double-minded, what does that mean? It means we think we can have best of us. I can be autonomous and not submit to God, and yet I can be happy. It's not possible. Not possible at all. Essentially what he's saying is quit playing games. Just acknowledge what you know within your heart is true. Acknowledge that, you've been afraid to look at it. You've been afraid to to look at some of the other issues. You've constructed all these arguments, but it's just primarily to justify your behavior. Facts are facts. There's no reason to hide from God behind the facts about his world. And then the toughest one of all, he says this, and humble yourself before the Lord. That's how you draw near. You humble yourself. And then he tells you, regardless of what you've done, no matter how long you've been saying it's just a mistake, nobody's perfect, no matter how long you do that, if you humble yourself, man, nobody likes to do that. And yet, it is the shortest route. It's the shortest route to receiving grace from God. Matter of fact, James says earlier, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to who? The humble. So I guess what I'm wanting to say to you as we come to the end of this series is this. Maybe you're not so much against God as you're just resisting him. You don't want him to be true. Because if he is real, it means some decisions on your part. And the best thing for any of us in this room, no matter where we are in the faith continuum, is to humble ourselves and come before him and admit that he is God and I'm not. And when I can make that admission, then my life begins to take a different course. And I have to deal with some issues, but man, when we start dealing with those, the light pops on, and the happiness we've been searching for then becomes to dwell in the words of Jesus, the shalom, the peace that will invade our life. So if you're here this morning and you've been playing around the edges, you've been attempting, just to keep God at arm's length, this morning might be the time for you to draw near to him. Just take a step towards him. We're going to offer an invitation this morning, and if that's a step that you need to take, we invite you to come as we stand and we sing together.